Does that sit all right? Mr. Chrysanthopoulos, again, welcome. You were here on our room for discussion in March with the interview we had with Jeroen Dijsselbloem. It's great now to have you here on our couch.
Thank you.
Since you are a former Greek ambassador to many countries, I would like to know if you observe the Greek crisis from a different perspective than most experts do.
Well, I observe the Greek crisis, first of all, as a Greek citizen. I mean, I've been living in Greece for the last 4 years, with one exception last year when I was living here in Holland. And it's a total disaster. I mean, we are having, first of all, our death rate has increased enormously. We have about 400 people dying in Greece per day, where under normal circumstances it should have been 200 people. Yeah. Suicides have increased by 48%. The hospitals are in a tragic situation because of lack of basic medicine, because about 50% of the cuts have hit the medical centers.
We will come back on the humanitarian solutions.
Mr. Legrain, welcome to you as well. I imagine that in Britain, Brexit is on the forefront of people's minds. Greece is probably not the first thing on people's minds. In fact, there may be a certain attitude of fatigue towards problems in the European South, as we might have here. Do you find that concerning?
Well, I mean, I'm not speaking on behalf of the British people in general. I'm speaking as someone who has been engaged in this, first of all, as a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics, as a writer on economic issues, as the author of European Spring, which you can buy on Amazon, and as independent economic advisor to the President of the European Commission during the crisis, 2011-2014. And therefore, having been both an insider and an outsider, I consider myself knowledgeable and engaged about these issues. And what the British people think is really not very material.
Yeah. And so the issue is still on the forefront of your agenda, but you seem also very actively engaged in other debates, like immigration, for example, judging from your own think tank, Open, and the event you will attend later today, right?
Yeah, sure. I mean, obviously, Greece is not the only thing that I'm involved with. The book, European Spring, is about how Europe and the Eurozone in particular has gone wrong, both its economies and its politics, and how to put them right. And I've set up a think tank called Open, which is at Open to Progress on Twitter, Open #2 Progress, which is about fighting back against those who want to destroy open societies like Geert Wilders or Marine Le Pen, Donald Trump or Nigel Farage.
Yeah, very interesting topic as well.
Mr. Leonidas, I would like to discuss an article you wrote in 2013 called Happy New Year. And you described that in Athens you smelled the smell of burning wood. Could you, in your experience, take us back to that moment? Could you describe what was happening in Greece at the time?
Well, it was a little bit earlier. It was around 2012 when we had the big, massive demonstrations against the regime. And these demonstrations were put down violently by the police. And fortunately, nobody was killed. We had about 800,000 people in the streets of Athens at that time. And these were the last demonstrations as a reaction to the measures that had been imposed upon Greece.
But the burned wood, was it because? But the burned wood, what was the cause of the why people smelled burned wood in Athens?
Well, that was because we didn't have the oil was so expensive that nobody could afford it. So we were using it as heating. We were using burning wood. We were burning wood, and then the government started saying that we're polluting Athens.
Yeah.
So we told the government, put down the prices of oil, and then Athens will stop being polluted.
You described this and a pretty grave human situation.
It's not only me that describes it. There have been 2 reports made by special representatives of the United Nations.
Yeah, the independent expert, right?
Yeah, the independent experts, where they describe the human rights violations that are taking place in Greece, and they actually tell what should be done to the lenders. And actually, the lenders should make an assessment before taking measures to what effect these measures will have on the impact of the everyday life of the people.
Because what kind of policy response led to this kind of impact that you describe?
Sorry, what?
What kind of policy response was implemented after the crisis that led to the situation that you described?
First of all, there was a reduction of all government expenses that covered all sectors, from the social sector, from the pensions, from salaries, everything.
Healthcare, yeah.
And an increase of taxes. I mean, I personally today cannot pay taxes. I don't pay taxes. And what the government is doing to me is that they have blocked all my accounts. I mean, I have a farm, I sell lemons. And now they blocked my lemon account, where I cannot receive money from the sale of lemons, etc. These are just small things.
Yes, I want to come to you, Mr. Legrain, because you are principal advisor to President of the European Commission, Mr. Barroso, from 2011 until 2014. Meaning you were there when the second bailout program was issued. What were the main discrepancies between what you deemed was an appropriate response for the crisis and the actual response by the Commission?
Well, just to be clear, I was hired as an independent advisor to provide a different perspective from the official advice that President Barroso was getting from Commission staff. So it's not that I ever thought that what was being done to Greece was the right thing and I changed my mind. From the start, I was hired to provide a different perspective because the crisis took all EU officials and governments by surprise. And remember, it started before Greece in 2007-8. And it got worse and worse and worse. And basically, European officials had no idea how to respond. And they were, for the most part, blind to looking at either evidence from history or indeed evidence from similar crises in emerging economies, saying, no, Europe is different, we know what's going on, and actually they didn't know what was going on. And though in policy terms, I don't agree with President Barroso, to his credit, he hired somebody with a different perspective to give him a different point of view, and that's what I did. And for me, the original sin, the catastrophic mistake, was in 2010 when it was clear that Greece could not pay its debts, and therefore, instead of writing down those debts and making the banks that had lent that money, French, German, British, Dutch banks, American banks that had lent money to the Greek government, instead of making them pay the price for that, European taxpayers' money was lent to Greece under the pretense that Greece actually could pay its debts. And as a result, you turn what is basically a battle between private creditors, the banks, and the Greek government into a battle, a national battle between, on the one hand, the Greek government, on the other hand, European taxpayers. And suddenly you have this dynamic where you have the likes of Mr. Dijsselbloem saying, well, you know, it's absolute, we cannot, it's not fair to make Dutch taxpayers pay the price for Greece's mistakes. Actually, the mistake was made in 2010 when your money, European taxpayers' money, was wrongly lent to Greece in order to bail out those banks. And since then, what we've done is imposed the harshest medicine possible on Greece to try and preserve the fiction that it would pay its debts. And the result is the worst collapse in any economy, in any advanced economy outside of war. And some of the social impact has been described there, but basically there's no end in sight to this.
So public sentiment was used as a convenient factor.
Well, it was about the lobbying power of banks, with each government in Europe thinking that banks based in its country are kind of national champions, and therefore the interest of the country is the same as the interest of the bank. And it was about the general atmosphere of crisis and the belief that it was impossible to impose losses on banks, and that's simply not true.
Okay, Mr. Legrain, I want to come back to the write-off of debt, mostly held by creditor countries like France and Germany, like you said. But in 2012, there was a 50% write-off of privately held debt. Do you don't think this was a very significant write-off, or?
Because what's happened is that it's a moving target. You have an unsustainable level of debt. You impose absolutely extreme austerity, well beyond the austerity that was imposed in the Netherlands. Absolutely extreme austerity. And therefore, the economy shrinks, and therefore the ability to pay that debt shrinks with it.
It's a percentage of GDP.
And you're just chasing that down. So yes, you have a write-off of debt, but it's not sufficient actually to make those debts sustainable. And so you're just digging an ever deeper hole. And now, as I said, you've got this situation where it's not fair at all that Dutch taxpayers or French taxpayers or German taxpayers should take losses because of the loans to Greece. But they shouldn't be angry with the Greek government or the Greek people. They should be angry with their governments, which made that terrible mistake in the guise of helping Greece, but actually to bail out banks.
I understand your point, Mr. Legrain, and I want to ask you, Mr. Chrysanthopoulos, if you agree with Mr. Legrain that what he said is actually it was a second bailout for the French and the German banks, rather than a bailout for Greece.
Yes, I totally agree with that. Plus the fact that whatever money was allocated to Greece never came to Greece. That's one thing. The other thing was that this money was, I mean, our debt GDP back in 2010 was 126%, and the money was given so that it would be eliminated. Today it's 178%.
I understand, but could you give some figures? How many of the bailout money, let's say the second bailout program, of the 110 billion euros, how much money was used for recapitalizing Greek banks and boosting the Greek economy, and how much money was used to service debt held by banks in creditor countries?
I'm not in a position to give you these numbers. I don't know them. I'll be very.
Mr. Legrain, do you maybe have an idea?
The numbers are in the book, and to be honest, I don't have them to hand. But what is true was, you can read the book to find out the exact figures. What is clear is that most of the money that was lent to Greece was either to repay private banks that should have taken losses, or to pay interest that shouldn't have been paid, or to repay European taxpayers, and very little of it actually went to Greece.
But why didn't the German and the Dutch government just bail out their banks? Why did they have to do an indirect bailout through Germany? I mean, is the one politically more difficult than the other? I don't understand.
I think absolutely. I mean, you know, had the losses been imposed on German and Dutch banks, some of them would have been in trouble, at which point the German or the Dutch governments needs to decide, are we going to bail them out or not? And if they do, then clearly that is visible that the government is using taxpayers' money to bail out those banks. Instead, through the Greek bailout, it's covert. You know, you're disguising it in, this is solidarity towards Greece. You know, we're doing this out of kindness for our Greek neighbors, and actually it's giving yet more money to the banks.
We've seen how upset people in Germany have become since there was kind of like a wealth transfer from north to south. So.
But that's the tragedy, because you've turned what is basically a financial crisis and a debt crisis, where the people you should be angry at are the banks, into a conflict between nations. And given the European project is about reconciling Europeans, but suddenly you're putting Europeans against each other. And that's the tragedy of this crisis.
How is it then that in 2013 the IMF itself acknowledged that they gravely underestimated the effects that austerity would have? Olivier Blanchard, chief economist of the IMF, he said that debt relief should be the main focus. Why is it still that after that there was such institutional rigidity in that sense?
Well, the view of the IMF already in 2010 was that Greek debts weren't sustainable. But as you know, European governments are major shareholders in the IMF, and they ensured that ultimately the view of the IMF staff was overridden, even though both IMF staff and members of the board, who weren't European, thought it was clear at that time that Greece couldn't pay its debts. And to the IMF's credit, at several points throughout the crisis, it has admitted that mistakes have been made. And I know that the IMF is unpopular in Greece, but also to its credit, right now it continues to say the debt situation in Greece is unsustainable. There needs to be further debt relief, and the people who are resisting it are other Eurozone governments for the reasons that I've given you.
I see.
Mr. Chrysanthopoulos, I now want to take it more to a Greek perspective. because before Alexis Tsipras was elected as prime minister in Greece, he was very strong on not agreeing with Trojka's terms. But in the end, he signed the third bailout, and we were where we were before. What happened?
Well, he proved himself to be the biggest lying prime minister that Greece ever had. I had actually helped Syriza in January 2015. From a PAM, with agreement from my party, I gave them our formula, how to resolve the crisis. I had a big meeting with their most important people. And then what happened was that when we had, until June, it was going rather well. He was keeping his promises. But at the summit, he accepted, he fell for the blackmail that was put on by Merkel and Schäuble, which was that you do what we want, or we create a chaos in the Greek banks. And he raised his hand and he gave up. What he should have done is he should have walked out, denounced the Germans in front of everybody on the blackmail that's being done to a member state, and cut off diplomatic relations for 6 months with Germany. That would have worked.
But don't you then not fear an even greater collapse of the economy?
No, we would not be going through this situation that we're going through now. We might have had a crisis for 6 months, we would have survived that. But today we would not be in this tragic situation of a country under occupation.
I understand. Interesting point.
Nonetheless, what do you make of the fact that Syriza, after they came to power, proposed a relatively modest social reform program, which was, even though Syriza is an ostensibly far-left party with some populist features, some say, the proposed economic program was quite social democratic in nature. Why was it not accepted?
Well, as I said, he has become the biggest liar in Greece now.
I mean, why was it not accepted by the European counterparts?
What? Well, because
the proposed Thessaloniki program.
Because
it was quite modest.
Because it was against the interest of the Europeans, what he had proposed in Thessaloniki. And they didn't want anything to do with that. As Phil said, it was the banks behind the whole situation.
Before we turn to our audience for an audience question, I want to ask one final question to Mr. Legrain, because I asked you that there was a major write-off in 2012. 50% of privately held debt was written off. Do you propose a 80% write-off, or I don't? Yeah.
As I said, it's a moving target, and actually it wasn't a 50% write-off because it wasn't all the debt, and there were all sorts of sweetener payments made to private creditors and so on. So in effect, you had money going out of one pocket into another. The reality is that had the debt been restructured, had been written down in 2010, once and for all, to reach a position where Greece was in a position to pay...
100% write-off?
No, to a sustainable level, where it was in a position to pay its debts, then you wouldn't have had the extreme austerity, you wouldn't have had the massive loss of confidence in the economy, you wouldn't have therefore had such a deep recession, the debt situation wouldn't have got much worse. So, the more that you kick the can down the road, the bigger the write-off ultimately has to be. And if you look at the IMF forecasts, they foresee that basically beyond 2030, Greece's debt spirals upwards to 280% plus. So ultimately, if you don't deal with the situation now, ultimately you're going to have an even bigger write-off to do in future. Now, from the point of view of today's politicians, Mr. Dijsselbloem will be retired, and Angela Merkel will too, and therefore it'll be somebody else's problem. And that's basically what this is about. It's about saying, well, we'll push it off into someone else's problem. The problem is that from a political perspective, that makes sense. From the perspective of the Greek people, it means that you suffer for ages, not in a perpetual depression, and the loss of empowerment in ostensibly a union of equals, of states who have decided to participate in a common endeavor and a common currency as equals, basically being a colony run by super technocrats at the European Commission, at the European Central Bank, and at the IMF. And clearly that is not right and shouldn't be sustainable.
Okay, interesting point. Thank you, Mr. Legrain. Is there an audience question, and please, on the austerity measures and on the IMF proposals?
Over there.
Sir in the blue shirt.
Okay, hello. I have a question in the sense that I think now in Greece it has become quite mainstream to believe that it was wrong to push off the debt write-off until 2012. I think even mainstream parties believe that it should have been done earlier. But even if that had happened, the government still had a 15% of GDP deficit at that point. Do you expect that people markets would finance that, or would there be a need for bailout money anyway in order to somehow sustain this this deficit and avoid the humanitarian crisis?
Sir Chrysanthopoulos.
Yeah, well, there is a basic difference with statistics in Greece and what's happening on the street. I mean, statistics do not relate at all with what is happening on the streets, where it's totally irrelevant. Now, I'm not sure. I don't think that I can answer your question. I'll be very honest with it. I cannot answer the question. I don't know.
Right. Mr. Legrain?
Of course, there would have been economic pain in any circumstances. You know, given the economic situation in 2010 in Greece, which is very serious, there was bound to be economic pain. Had there been debt rate write-offs and, say, a moratorium on interest payments, and had the fiscal adjustment process happened gradually, then the hole that Greece would have been much shallower. The fiscal situation, therefore, would have been better. You wouldn't have had the aggravating factors of the loss of business confidence and the fall of investment, and therefore it would have been a gradual and much more shallower process of adjustment and less painful, rather than an extreme, brutal one from which there is no recovery.
Could you not, I was thinking about it, could you not keep part of the debt and use the bailout money to grow out of your debt? So you keep, let's say, 80% of the debt, but the bailout money is mostly used to invest in schools and in infrastructure so that Greece can grow out of its debt. Do you think that might be a viable solution or no?
Well, I mean, I think, look what happened after the Second World War, where Germany had emerged from a period of Nazi rule. How was Germany treated? There was a write-down of German debt, and there was a Marshall Plan of investment with foresighted American policymakers saying, we're not going to have a scorched earth policy, we're not going to make the mistakes of the Versailles Treaty after the First World War, we are going to finance an investment-led recovery in Europe. And we ought to have had a Marshall Plan, not just for Greece, but for Southern Europe, and indeed for Europe in general, to get the economy going after the crisis. And it's a tragic missed opportunity not to have had that. It would have cost very little. At the time, interest rates, and even now, interest rates are almost zero. You can borrow for 10 years for nothing, and there are plenty of investment projects which would have a positive return. So it actually wouldn't have cost anything because the returns from it would have exceeded the costs of it.
Yeah, but in 2010, the interest rate on Greek bonds was not that low, were they?
The Marshall Plan wouldn't have been from the Greek government. The Marshall Plan would have been a European investment.
Thank you.
Mr. Graham, briefly going back to the fiscal situation in Greece already, also before the crisis, were there any structural deficiencies in the Eurozone that led to this and that led to the crisis? Possibly structural deficiencies in the setup of the euro?
Well, I think we have this sort of mistake in the Eurozone to look at this as if this is sort of somehow separate from what was going on elsewhere. There was a massive bubble in the financial system across Western economies, including the UK, including the United States, including Iceland and elsewhere, in the years up to 2007-8. There was an orgy of bad lending by Western banks to the Greek government, to Spanish property developers, to Portuguese consumers, to American homeowners, to British homeowners, to all and sundry. And then that bubble burst and a reckoning need to be had. The policies which were pursued elsewhere in the Eurozone and in Britain and the United States were flawed, but they were nowhere near as bad as those that were applied to Greece.
So why specifically then did they hit Greece so disproportionately, the effects?
They hit Greece so disproportionately
extra vulnerable.
because of that crucial mistake in 2010 of not writing down the public debt and making this into a political issue between governments. The power of the banking sector is such that in Europe in general, after 2007-8, there were mass bailouts of banks, including here in the Netherlands. Mass bailouts of banks without us actually forcing them for a long time to actually deal with the bad loans on their balance sheets, and without passing on the benefits of that debt reduction to the companies and to the households, which should have happened and would have ensured a faster and stronger recovery.
Mr. Chrysanthopoulos, so we've seen that there are a lot of asymmetric interests between Northern Europe and Southern Europe, not only from economic thinking, but so I would like to ask you how the currency, the euro, has exacerbated this problem for Greece.
Greece. Okay, but first of all, allow me to say that this crisis might have been avoided had, at the outset, had Germany increased their prices, which would have devalued the euro vis-à-vis the dollar and other things, which would have allowed Greece, Portugal, and Spain, perhaps, to increase their exports, and thus alleviating the situation and not having to deal with such extreme situations.
So you say lower wages for Germany could be a very good solution for Greece to regain competitiveness.
Yeah, then. And in that way, this whole thing could have been avoided. But what do you say?
As I said, what there should have been, leaving aside Greece, but across the Eurozone, what there should have been is early in the crisis, restructuring of banks, imposing losses on their creditors, writing down the debts, unsustainable debts that households and companies can't pay, a massive program of investment financed at low interest rates, the ECB intervening sooner to prevent the panic which almost destroyed the Eurozone, and instead of pursuing this kind of beggar thy neighbor Germanic pursuit of export competitiveness, whereby you drive wages down as somehow the solution to the crisis. Instead, you focus on boosting productivity in order to pay higher wages. Yes. Because ultimately, if you have a situation where the government is cutting back, where consumers can't spend because their wages are driven down, and you have these big debts to pay, you're making that situation even harder to deal with. You're not actually finding a way out.
Okay, I understand that you cannot be austere on the whole continent at once, but is it maybe not a solution that if, for example, Northern Europe, like the Netherlands and Germany, would just spend more, have large deficits, and that Greece would have balanced budgets, so that the spillovers would reach from Northern Europe to Southern Europe, for example?
Like I said, I think the mistakes were not just made in Greece with respect to Greece. You had an unnecessary recession here in the Netherlands in 2011-12, which was caused by the government of a country running a huge current account surplus, which has a lower public debt than Greece, which had interest rates at record lows, saying what we really need to do now, just as a housing bubble is burst, just as consumers around Europe don't want to spend, just as there's a loss of business confidence, what we really want to do is tighten our belts. And that's just bad economics. It's not learning the lessons from the Great Depression. It's not looking at what the United States did. It's simply saying, we are going to pursue exactly the same policies we might have done, say, in the inflationary 1970s when everyone else is growing. And that was, completely the wrong thing to do. Yeah. And it imposed unnecessary harm here in the Netherlands. Nothing, of course, like the harm which is imposed on Greece, but still unnecessary harm.
Yeah. Mr. Chrysanthopoulos, what were then the most immediate problems of these spending cuts in Greece?
Well, as I said before, it was basically social, health,
There were no nurses for the patients to treat them.
No, there is no medicine, nothing. I mean, you go to the hospital, you carry your sheets with you, you have the pharmacy, you go, you buy the medicines there. And then Social Security was cut. I mean, the people lost their money, lost everything, and they had to go to the hospitals that didn't have anything. They had to pay the hospitals. So many people just prefer to stay home and die.
Yeah.
What about the current situation?
It's,
Alexis Tsipras gave an interview in which he said Greece is back on track.
Don't believe him. I mean, I mean, if he was Pinocchio, I mean, he'd have a nose to the end of eternity.
Okay.
I mean, it would be so long. No, Greece is not back Greece is not back on track. Perhaps the statistics may show a little improvement, but down on the street, it's getting worse and worse. More people are foraging into the garbage cans to get food in Athens and in the countryside now.
Yeah. So we understand now that if the government cuts back spending, that there is no aggregate demand in the economy. We've seen in the Netherlands, but also, as you say, in Greece and in Germany. But now I want to go to the fundamental problem of the euro currency. Could you please elaborate, Mr. Legrain, how this euro currency has exaggerated the problem?
Is it necessarily a problem?
Yeah, is it?
Well, I think, the whole purpose of the euro was to create, or one of the purposes of the euro was to create convergence between its economies, i.e. to help the poor catch up with the rich. And that seemed to be working well in the years up to 2007. And instead, since then, it's gone into reverse. So instead of causing convergence, it's caused divergence. And you see that Greece is actually poorer than it was at the launch of the euro. So clearly, something isn't working. If you look at beyond Greece, I think there are several things wrong. You have an extremely rigid fiscal straitjacket, the Enhanced Stability and Growth Pact and the Fiscal Compact, which says, first of all, makes no distinction between governments borrowing in order to consume and governments borrowing in order to invest. And there's a crucial difference, because if you're going to invest, then you're going to boost growth both now and in future, and that in turn is going to boost future tax revenues. It treats each individual Eurozone economy as it was an island, and therefore takes no account of how they each interact with each other. So it doesn't look at the overall fiscal stance of the monetary union. And last but not least, crucially, it doesn't allow that flexibility, which I've talked about, that in a recession, you need to borrow more in order to stimulate growth and get out of the hole. That's one of the problems. Second of all, you've had a central bank which for far too long wasn't doing its duty, which stepped back and said, well, we're going to allow a financial panic to rip through the Eurozone, potentially destroy it, and it's not our business to intervene. Which clearly caused massive harm.
What should have the central bank have done for Greece?
Sorry?
Yeah, go on.
It should have made clear, as Mario Draghi finally did in the summer of 2012, that in the event of a financial panic, it would step in to prevent that panic, which is really nothing surprising. It's what the Bank of England would do. It's what the Federal Reserve would do in the United States. It's what any central bank would do, which is why you don't have financial panics in their debt markets.
So in 2009, you say the ECB, for example, should have bought government debt in Greece.
Had it launched its QE program in 2009, there wouldn't have been a financial panic, for example. And indeed, crazily, in the midst of a financial panic, the ECB raised interest rates in 2011, as indeed it did in 2008, exacerbating the crisis. And indeed, it's a very strange situation we have in the Eurozone, whereby most countries have independent central banks, but they have independent central banks where ultimately the central bank is accountable and indeed under the control of the government, i.e. if the government says, buy our bonds, help us out, prevent a crisis, they will do it. The ECB sits above the 19 Eurozone governments. It has no political master, and it acts politically. It says, well, okay, we're going to bail out, we're going to lend money to banks that are in distress, except if we don't like the policies of the government in that country, as happened with Greece. Or we're going to buy government bonds of a government that's suffering a financial panic, but only if they do all sorts of things that we tell them to do,
Yeah,
which
on
is
our
well
conditions,
beyond our remit. We're going to write a letter to someone I don't like, Silvio Berlusconi, in effect forcing him out of office. And whatever you think about Silvio Berlusconi, he was the elected prime minister, and Jean-Claude Trichet was elected by nobody. So all sorts of things there going wrong. And the sort of elephant in the room, which is in a monetary union, you have to have a way of tackling imbalances. To our credit, we created a system called the macroeconomic imbalance procedure, which was to force adjustment not just on countries which have current account deficits, but also on those which have current account surpluses, such as Germany and the Netherlands. The rules were skewed so that actually you had to have a surplus of above 6% for there to be a need to act. Germany has a surplus of 8% plus, and the European Commission just says, oh, well, we can't really say anything to Germany. And Germany says it's not a problem. So Germany says you have to obey the crazy fiscal rules, but actually where it suits us, we're not going to obey the rules on surpluses. And what does that do? It means that there is continually a deficiency of demand in the Eurozone, continually exporting deflation to Southern Europe, in continually forcing the burden of adjustment onto Southern Europe through lower prices, even though they have high debts. Instead of that, slightly higher inflation in Germany, more of a focus on productivity gains instead of wage cuts, and you would have had a balanced adjustment, which would have been much, much better.
Is it then also, in your opinion, a solution to give more authority to the European Central Bank?
Sorry?
Is it, in your opinion, a solution to give more authority to the European Central Bank and centralize fiscal decision-taking?
No, I think that the European Central Bank needs to have a political master, and in the absence of a federal Eurozone government, then it needs to be the Eurogroup or some other group of governments. It's absolutely unacceptable in a democracy to have a central bank which acts unaccountably in increasingly political ways.
So concerted action is what is needed, really, among different parties and the nation states.
You need to have the Eurozone functioning more like every other advanced economy around the world, where you have, if you're going to have an independent central bank, it has limited independence, i.e. the government says, here's the inflation target, you meet it. Not we, the central bank, decide how we're going to behave and whether we're going to help or whether we're going to do our job or not.
So, Mr. Chrysanthopoulos, don't you then think it's very ironic that this euro that would have led us to an ever closer union has actually created a very core periphery dynamic then?
Yes. Yes, because the European Union started in a totally different way, and now, as we have seen, it's ending up in a totally different way. I mean, that when we were negotiating our accession back in the 70s, it was a EEC of the people.
Yeah.
And now it has been transferred into a European Union of the banks, and nobody giving a damn about the fate of the European people.
So the financial sector has like taken over the
Yes,
political process in Europe, is what you're saying?
Yes, as we said. But just to add one thing about the euro, the problem that we faced with it was the fact that it's not allowed to devalue the euro.
Exactly, that was the essential question. Thank you. And because it's not able to devalue their own currency, that is why you say that the Southern Europe has large trade deficits, and Northern Europe has large trade surpluses. What is the solution to that, Mr. Legrain, to this currency problem that countries in Northern Europe are taking advantage of this?
Well, like I said, what we've had is not just asymmetric, but one-sided adjustment. Before, when the crisis hit, you had some countries running surpluses and some countries running deficits. And instead of there being a balanced adjustment where both adjust, you've had the countries running deficits forced to run surpluses, and the countries running surpluses running ever bigger surpluses, and that includes Germany and the Netherlands.
Is it
And the consequence of that, as I said, is that you're forcing the burden of adjustment onto Southern Europe. You're making the burden of adjustment much harder. Exactly. You're forcing Southern Europe, which has high debts, to make that that adjustment harder by having deflation rather than a bit more inflation.
Because
and you're focusing on cutting wages instead of boosting productivity. And those are the wrong way forward.
Because cutting wages in Greece is not the solution to regain competitiveness, right? Because Greece is also competing on very different capital goods markets than, for example, Germany, right? They're not direct competitors of each other.
I think the crucial point to get across is that competitiveness is not what policymakers should be pursuing.
Yeah.
So if you're a business, you might say, I want to be competitive. I want to keep wage costs down in order to sell as much as possible and keep my profits up. But from a point of view of society as a whole, wages aren't a cost. Wages are a benefit. You want actually not wages to be as low as possible.
Exactly, yeah.
You want wages as high as possible, provided they're justified by productivity. So instead of saying, keep pushing wages down, which is the narrow-minded businessman's perspective, from a societal point of view, you want wages as high as possible. And to do that, you need to focus on boosting productivity. That in turn, obviously, then makes the economic adjustment easier because instead of having low demand, you have high demand. So then when Germany will say, well, look, how can you criticize the economy? Look how successful we are. Clearly there's nothing wrong with us. Actually, it's because Germany is relying on other people's demand. It's relying on people in other countries continuing to spend or other people continuing to borrow and spend in order to buy German products. And what works for one country can't work for all of the Eurozone. The Eurozone is simply too big. To a certain extent, it's been trying to push the problem onto the rest of the world. But there's a limit to which the world's second biggest economy can do that.
Yeah. I would like to add what we see as a solution to the problem of Greece, which is something that has been promoted by my political party, EPAM, and it is what we
Come on the next. Yeah, okay, go on, yeah.
Yeah. So it's actually 5 steps. The first is we denounce the agreements of May 2010 on the basis of international law.
Yeah.
The Treaty of Vienna on Treaties, Articles 48 to 52, say under which circumstances an international treaty is null and void. At the same time, we nationalize the Bank of Greece, and we use its assets, which are about 98 billion euros at this moment. The third step is that once we nationalize the Bank of Greece, they will ask us to leave the Eurozone.
We will come back in the future of Greece. So I'm happy you made these 3 points because that's a perfect bridge for the last part. So I will come back right to you, Mr. Chrysanthopoulos. Before we do that, I would like to ask if there's an audience question. And sir, over there, yes. And to whom you would ask the audience question?
I think best to the little gentleman in the back who used words of German products. Because I asked the leader in the Dutch parliament, do you know that 50% of the debts of the Greek country is due to the military industry of Germany? And then he said, yes, I do know. Do you know that those were first private debts and that they were turned into governmental debts? So now I wonder, this is an interest of European people, their defense, their security with those weapons, they are bought. Why should the Greek people pay with their health or even their lives? Thank you.
Well, I think if you're asking about the spending choices of the Greek government, then it should probably be my colleague who should answer. Ultimately, if the Greek government chooses to spend on weapons rather than on medicines, and to the extent that isn't stipulated by outsiders, then clearly the Greek people ought to be criticizing their government for so doing. The tensions with Turkey are much less than there were. There's much less need to spend on defense than there might have been. And in a time of crisis where people are going without medicines or going without food, it's a strange political choice.
Let's possibly have another question.
Madam with a blue, grayish t-shirt, please.
Do you think there is a policy behind it that that Germany would actually want to force Greece to privatize their economy, to privatize the airports, the railroads, and the shipyards, and the islands, and the tourist industry. Like, I think also the recognition of Croatia was the first step to privatize former Yugoslavia.
Yeah, Mr. Chrysanthopoulos,
Yes.
is the Greek government forced to privatize?
Yes, it is.
important-
But what the scandal is that, for example, we privatized our airports to the German public sector. For example, Fraport belongs by a large percentage to the,
Yeah.
to the public sector of Germany. So what kind of privatization is that?
Yeah, it's selling valuable assets for peanuts, is what you
No,
you
no.
say. No.
Privatization means you sell it from the public sector,
public
it
sector, of
goes to
course.
the private
Of
sector.
course.
So we are privatizing to the German public sector,
Understand.
and they also got loans from Greek banks to finance this so-called privatization.
And then the whole
It's-
circle
It's
is-
a total
is-
scandal.
Yeah, it's okay. Now for our last part, because we have discussed all the doom and gloom for Greece. Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras says that Greece is back on track. Now he's a liar, as you said, Mr. Chrysanthopoulos. Now it's able to fulfill its obligations, and it's able to borrow money on primary capital markets in 2018. We've just discussed unemployment is still above 20%, and growth is just not
27%.
27%. Okay, above 20, well above 20%
Yeah,
then.
yeah.
And growth is just not picking up fast enough in making its debt rather unsustainable. Maybe it's interesting to look at some cases to see which options we still have to obtain a healthy economy for Greece in the future. And to begin with you, Mr. Chrysanthopoulos, is it because of these asymmetric interests that we just have discussed that you and your political party, EPAM, see no other solution than a departure for Greece out of the Eurozone?
Yes, yes. And let me explain to you how it will happen. I mean, what the idea is.
Yeah, please.
It's not easy. So as I said before, we repudiate the agreements of May 2010 on the basis of the Vienna Treaty on treaties. We sent a letter to the Secretary General of the United Nations saying we invoke Articles 48 to 52. The second step, at the same time, we nationalized the Bank of Greece. We use the assets of it, which is about 98 billion euros to finance the Greek economy. The third thing that we do is that they will tell us, okay, once you did this to the bank or to the national bank, you can no longer remain in the Eurozone. We agree with that. So what will we do? We will use a transitory period of 7 months to 1 year, how we joined the euro, and the same way we will leave the euro. We will print electronic euros at the outset. I mean, I get my pensions in euro today. I will still be getting them in electronic euros. I won't be able to cash it. That's the only thing for a certain period. After 7 months, we will start putting out the national currency. Let me just finish the 5 steps, and then we can go to the. At the same time, we go back to the taxation that existed in 2009. We do away with all the debts of the people towards the government on taxes that occurred between 2010 until today, and we do away with the private debts that have been caused by the banking
Helped
sector.
by the Greek.
But why, Mr. Chrysanthopoulos, do you concretely believe that Greece has no future anymore in the Eurozone? Why
Because
could
we
you
see
not
it.
see a scenario where you see Greece remaining?
It won't work. It won't work.
Why, concretely?
He explained it to it.
But I'm sure that Mr. Legrain would disagree, and he does see a future for Greece in the Eurozone. Could you convince Mr. Chrysanthopoulos why that might be the case, if you believe that?
Well, my preference would be to put in place reforms to make the euro work, and that would be debt relief for Greece. It would be sensible fiscal rules, or better still, a common fiscal institution. It would be a less deflation-minded, more democratically accountable central bank, and it would be a system of balanced adjustment which involves both surplus countries and deficit countries.
But even if
I think if we put in place those changes, and as well, last but not least, ensuring that when banks run into trouble, that the losses fall on their creditors rather than on taxpayers. I think we put in place those reforms, the Eurozone could work. I fear that they're not going to be put in place.
Yeah.
And I fear that for Greece, basically the choice is either go through a wrenching adjustment of trying to leave the euro now, which has a very high immediate cost, but some prospect of recovery later, or basically perpetual stagnation.
Yeah.
Again, if you look at the IMF, their latest forecast, they estimate even on an optimistic basis that the long-term growth rate in Greece is 1%. This is in one of the poorest members of the Eurozone, so basically never catching up with the rest of Europe, actually falling ever further behind. I don't think that's sustainable. So it's a choice between a crisis now versus perpetual stagnation. From the point of view of the Eurozone, at the moment, things have got finally better. 10 years after the crisis, we've had a lost decade, but finally economies are growing again. Finally, unemployment is falling, although in most countries it's still higher than before the crisis. And finally, wages are rising again, though in most cases they've stagnated for a decade. The thing is, the flaws haven't really been fixed. They've been papered over. So if we have another recession or another crisis, all the terrible things that we've seen in recent years can happen all over again, at which point then there will need to be a decision. Do we make the reforms needed to make this work, or is the whole thing going to fall apart?
Mr. Legrain, I understand that you say that the conservatism, institutionally wise, is probably going to maintain for the next 10, 20 years. So, but even if we look at the other case, even if we centralize our union and democratize our union, Germans will never accept with the solidarity, with the cultural divide there is at the moment, that wealth will be transferred from north to south. So then we end up in the same problem we were before, actually.
Okay, I think there are three viable solutions. One is a federal solution. We know that federal states like the United States or Germany, with the Deutschmark, or Australia or Canada or so on, work well. So federalism is one solution. I don't think it's politically possible anytime soon, but it's one viable solution economically.
Yeah.
A second solution is breaking up the euro. We know that it's possible to have national currencies, and we know that can work as well. Is there a third solution? Well, I put forward in this book an idea for a decentralized euro, which is to say, the German argument is we can't be expected to shoulder the losses of Southern Europe, or indeed of anyone who borrows too much. And if you put in place laws that say that when banks run into trouble, the losses fall on their creditors, not on taxpayers. Yeah. Likewise, when governments get into trouble, their debts are restructured rather than bailed out by other European taxpayers, then the German fears about their money being used to bail out others are not justified, at which point you don't have to have the whole fiscal straitjacket and torture instruments that have been created. In fact, I mean, you could even say that it even fits even with the German or the liberal perspective that you have to align liability control, liability lies at the national level, control lies at the national level. What would that mean? It means that you could restore democracy at a national level. You could have governments elected which says, we're going to pursue a different fiscal policy than Mr. Schäuble wants. Yeah. And if we run into trouble, we'll bear the consequences of that. And if we want to do things differently, we can. I think that's a perfectly viable solution within the Eurozone. Unfortunately, we've gone down the wrong direction, which is of
making Greece like the Netherlands,
of part centralization, of making it far too rigid, of favouring creditors over debtors. And I think the politics of that are poisonous, and I think the economics of it are tragic.
Yeah. The core question is then: do you see evidence of the will among the European technical and various political bodies to implement these changes, to go beyond the simple overpapering of problems and look at the problems again with a fresh eye structurally? Do you see evidence of that?
Not particularly, no. I mean, obviously, we've just seen the election of President Macron in France, and he has said that he's going to make on Tuesday big proposals for how to reform the EU and the Eurozone. So we'll wait to see what he has to say. Judging from what he said in the past, what he wants is some kind of small Eurozone budget. And the price that he seems willing to pay for that is even tighter national fiscal controls in order to get Germany's approval. And it seems to me that a token Eurozone budget doesn't really solve any problem. And even tighter national fiscal controls will make things worth economically and politically. So it doesn't seem to me that that is the way forward. But I wait to see what he has to say. You know, he surprised many people with his success this year, so maybe he'll surprise us with his proposals on Tuesday.
Are you not optimistic about the rise of Macron, even though that you want Euro out for Greece?
Well, taking a look from where his background is,
Yeah.
I'm not very optimistic about.
No? Because he's a banker, of course.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, cool, interesting. Maybe one more audience question on the way forward. Mister. There's going to be a mic in 1 second. Thank you.
Thanks. If Greece quits European Union, how that will affect tourism?
Yeah, interesting question, Mr.
Well, we had tourism before we joined the European Union. And we will continue having tourism whatever happens. But the problem with tourism is that we have many tourists come and very few leaving money in Greece with the various programs, all-inclusive and all that. That's the big problem that we're facing.
Possibly a last one?
Mr. Yes.
Sorry. Yeah.
You mentioned a few times that there is this problem between democratic legitimacy of taking decisions and bankers behaving as politics and banking sector and financial sector taking over the whole European Union interests. So when you say democratization, what exactly are you talking about apart from a Federal Reserve? Could the solution in the future be something like United States of Europe, where we kind of make more than just fiscal decisions altogether, but generally behave as one thing? Could this solve stuff, or it could lead to the other way?
Mr. Legrain, what is the democratic process for Europe?
I set out in the book, and I outlined just earlier, I mean, one option is to create a genuinely federal Europe with, at the very least, a federal treasury and accountability to a Eurozone parliament, which in effect would be European parliamentarians from Eurozone countries. Is that working still?
No, it's working now.
Okay, so that's one thing. I don't think politically that's feasible. I don't think in the Netherlands it would be acceptable. I think there are many people in the Netherlands who want to be in a federal Europe. However attractive it might be sometime in the future. I think the alternative to that, as I said, is to restore national economic flexibility and democracy. And that doesn't mean leaving the euro. It means loosening the fiscal controls at a national level so that you have the ability to make independent choices, you have the ability to invest in the future, you have the ability to respond to crises, and you have the ability to elect governments who make the choices that people want about taxation and spending rather than it being dictated by absurd rules imposed by outsiders. I fear that if you do neither of those two things, then the Eurozone, which managed to get through this crisis, will break up in greater acrimony in the next crisis, at which point we get the likes of Marine Le Pen or worse in power, and who knows where that ends up.
Thank you for your audience question. Before ending our discussion, I would like to ask both guests, what is your prediction, Mr. Chrysanthopoulos, for the next 10 years for Greece?
Well, we want to get out of this mess. We want to stop being a colony of the European Union. We want to get back our independence.
But are we gonna see this? Are we continuing the path we're on now? You think? Or?
Well, I hope not. But I hope that the Greek people understand that the only way to do things is to go back to the street and vote for governments that have a specific solution to the problems. As I said, we have a proposal. We are the only EPAM is the only political party outside of Parliament that has a specific proposal to get out of the crisis. We have even done a computer simulation to see if it would work. It would, with difficulties.
In the meantime, we hope for a better scenario, right? Mr.
We
Legrain?
hope for debt relief for Greece. I mean, to his credit again, when he was economy minister and including during his recent visit to Greece, Emmanuel Macron has been positive about the case for debt relief for Greece. Let's hope that Chancellor Merkel, in presumably her last term in office, if she's re-elected on the weekend, decides that finally I need to solve the credible situation we've caused in Greece, and finally to release it from the debtor's prison in which it's locked up, and hopefully then you can start to see a recovery.
Before we thank our guest, I would like to remind the audience that we have another interview tomorrow as well.
Yeah,
rather unusual that we have 2 interviews in 1 week, but also very convenient because it's about the German elections, and German elections will take place in Germany this Sunday, so make sure to attend that interview as well. Next week we have exam at the university, but the week after we will come back with the guest Klaas Knot. He's president of the Dutch Central Bank. For now, please thank our guest, Mr. Chrysanthopoulos and Mr. Legrain. A warm applause, please.